Hello everybody, today I want to talk about the autism spectrum and a lot of misconceptions I see around people who aren't very knowledgeable on autism and how they perceive the spectrum. So everybody knows that there is an autism spectrum. No one person with autism is alike. There could be someone with autism, such as myself, where a majority of people will not notice my autistic traits until they know me for quite some time. Whereas on the exact opposite end, there are some people with autism who haven't even spoken for the first time in their 20s. And are in constant need of care. Now, because the condition between me and this hypothetical person have the same name, people often mistake us for being on the same spectrum, the autism spectrum, because of that. But if we look at the differences between me and this hypothetical person more logistically, it doesn't really make sense to put us into the same category at all. Obviously, I mean this with no offense to anybody who does suffer from severe or low functioning autism. But I don't blame people for accidentally thinking that we're on the same autism spectrum, as the terminology keeps shifting over the years as we find out more and more about autism. But I personally like to see high functioning autism and low functioning autism as two separate conditions with two separate spectrums, because as there are similar traits between the two conditions, the permanent non-improvable factors of a low functioning autistic versus a high functioning autistic are fundamentally different. And I believe if these conditions were to be named for the first time in current day with all of the knowledge we know, they would have two completely different names for them. The reason for this is, as I said before, the intrinsic permanent factors that the people with each condition start out with. Someone born with low functioning autism have a lot more they have to deal with other than just not understanding social situations. Firstly, there's the physical and mental inability to talk and make proper sentences. Despite genuinely wanting to communicate properly, they simply can't, and it's extremely hard or borderline impossible for them to learn how to talk fluently. Same goes for other basic functions such as walking, whereas someone born with high functioning autism might have some trouble in comparison to neurotypical children in developing speech and walking, but generally they don't have too much trouble with that, and all of their struggles purely stem from understanding social skills. Now you may be thinking that's just different autistic people starting on different ends of the spectrum. I started out on the higher end and someone else started on the lower end. Well, I don't think that's necessarily the case. As someone born with high-functioning autism, being raised and taught in the worst way possible to get them as low on the spectrum as possible, versus someone who started out low-functioning with the best support to make them the most functioning low-functioning autistic person, if you compare those two hypothetical people, they won't really meet halfway. The perfect example is Christian. This is a very infamous, high-functioning autistic person on the internet that, due to their own actions, as well as the environment around them, is pretty much the case study for the worst possible case scenario in where a high-functioning autistic person can end up mentally. But in comparison to the low-functioning people that I've been describing up until this point, Christian can still form full sentences, can still walk around, and has the ability to communicate with other people. He has these basic traits and has been able to physically function normally since he was a child. Whereas someone with low functioning autism, even with the best care possible, it can still sometimes take into adulthood for them to even start speaking and having conversations. So whereas there is similarities between the two types of autism, and there is a spectrum for both types, I don't really think that spectrum crosses over in any way. Obviously, there's a ton of similarities between the two conditions, which is why they were both called autism. But personally, I don't think it's very accurate and informative to talk about them as if it's one spectrum, because while autism does manifest differently in each person, which is why there is a spectrum, I don't really think the skills of taking care of a low-functioning autistic can carry over to high-functioning autistic and vice versa. Whereas the skills of taking care of one high-functioning autistic can carry over to another, even if your approach and the circumstances aren't exactly the same due to them being two different people. And same with low-functioning autistics. Hopefully all of that made sense. I really was just rambling. And I don't know if this is like an official medical diagnosis of low-functioning and high-functioning being completely two different conditions. That's more of just my observation and opinion as an autistic man. Now, I know I described the spectrums as kind of like a ladder that you can go up and down in life, rather than a set position that you were stuck with from birth until death, which, if it is viewed that way, high functioning and low functioning being on the same spectrum does make sense, but that's not personally how I view it, as I think autistic people, both high functioning and low functioning, functioning can improve or worsen their autism as time goes on, causing them to be lower or higher on the spectrum, since the spectrum is based on how close that individual is to being a neurotypical person, with higher on the spectrum being closer and lower being farther away. Which is why I think low functioning and high functioning autistics, while everyone's starting point on each spectrum may be different, it can change over time. But because of how drastically different being high functioning versus low functioning is, I do think there are two different spectrums. But that's just my opinion. I would love to hear what you guys have to say in the comment section below. And if you want to hear me go more in depth on how high functioning autistic people can raise or lower themselves on the spectrum, be sure to subscribe with notifications on, as I will be talking about that in my next video. But with all that being said, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you then.